Here's one of my favorite editing techniques to draw my viewer's eye through my photo and keep them interested in the subject. I've used this technique on every photo I've edited since 2022. I want to show you why this technique works, how I avoid making mistakes, and if you stick around until the very end, I'll show you how I use it in Lightroom. The editing technique I use is the linear gradient mask. You might be asking at this point, why is this such an important technique to use in editing? The answer lies in the roots of what keeps your viewer interested in your photo. Let's go through 3 key elements that come into play. The first one being depth. Within a photo, there are 3 areas that can be created that include the foreground, middle ground, and background. Making use of all of them creates depth to the photo that keeps the viewer's eye moving from front to back without even realizing it. The linear gradient mask is used to reduce emphasis on the foreground and background. A key way of doing this is making the foreground go from dark to light as it approaches the subject. This leads into composition. By making use of a common composition technique called the rule of thirds, the photo can easily be split into a foreground, middle ground, and background, which helps to place the subject of the photo at an interesting location at one of the intersection points. Again, the linear gradient is used to draw the viewer's eye to the subject. Keep in mind, this technique can be used with any other composition type. For the third element, you'll want to enhance your composition by reducing the sharpness in the areas surrounding your subject. This will also assist in drawing your viewer's eye to the subject, as the sharpest part of the photo should immediately catch the viewer's eye. If you haven't noticed, there's a theme here, and that's the answer to why this is such an important editing technique. You want the linear gradient to take the viewer directly to the subject. Before we jump into Lightroom to edit a few photos, let's quickly go over how you can avoid making mistakes with this editing technique. There are 3 common mistakes that need to be considered. The first one being obvious transitions. This type of mistake happens when a gradient has a harsh or noticeable transition that looks unnatural. To avoid this, always make sure to soften the transition by adjusting the feathering. This will create a smoother and more natural blend between the affected and unaffected areas. The second mistake that gets made with linear gradients is an inconsistent light source. This happens when a linear gradient mask is applied in a way that contradicts the natural direction of the light in the photo and leads to an unrealistic lighting effect. You'll want to make sure that you align gradients with the existing light direction in the photo. For example, if the light's coming from one side of the photo, the gradient mask should enhance that light direction and not oppose it. The third mistake often seen is over-applying gradients. This can make the image look artificial and over-processed. Again, we want this edit to look natural so the viewer doesn't even realize it's helping them through the photo. Be sure to use gradients sparingly and with a purpose. Subtle adjustments will yield the best results, so be sure to review the image frequently while editing. And when in doubt, step away for a little bit and come back a few hours later to make sure the gradient isn't overpowering the photo. Hey photographers, if you're passionate about capturing stunning photos and want to stay updated with the latest in camera gear, shooting techniques, and editing tips, hit the subscribe button below now. Join my community and take your photography skills to the next level with my in-depth reviews and expert advice. Don't miss out and subscribe today. So now let's jump over to Lightroom to see how I use linear gradient mask to enhance my photos. Looking at this first image of a recent trip to Croatia that I took, there's a foreground, a midground, and a background here. So we can verify this going in, just taking a quick look here, rule of thirds, you can roughly see how I've set this photo up whenever I took it. So now let's look at how you would advance this using a linear gradient mask. You'll be here in the develop mode and you'll want to go here to the mask button. So once you get in here, what you can do is you can click create mask and then do a linear gradient. So this will now give you the crosshairs where you can drag up from wherever you need to create that mask. So looking here, we'll start with the bottom one. Let's just make sure my old one is turned off so you can see how I'm doing this. So having this one in here, you can see there's still a couple of options that show up here. If you want to stretch this one from the bottom, you can go ahead and click the red button down there. If you want to move the entire gradient mask, you can click this box and drag it. You can also stretch using the second from the top button, or if you still want to rotate it, you can do this. Now, an interesting option here, when you created it, you could have rotated it here while holding your left mouse button and dragging, but you also could have held shift at that time to then make sure that this snapped parallel to the horizon. So let's leave this where it's at here. And what I'm gonna do is I wanna draw the viewer's eye up here to this bell tower. So we're gonna reduce the exposure down to -1 just to help darken this area up. And then I also wanna go in here and I wanna reduce the sharpness and increase the noise reduction just to make sure that this area doesn't stay sharp. Now let's move on to the next area that we wanna mask, and that's gonna be the sky. So I go create a new linear mask, and again, I'm gonna draw from the top here, and you'll see here how I can rotate this, but whenever I click the shift button and hold it down, now it snaps. So let's pull down here about midway through the photo. Now one thing you'll notice is it ended up including Diocletian's palace and some of the tops of these other buildings. So what I'm gonna do is go over here, and I'm gonna click on this mask, and then click subtract, and I'm going to do select subject. So you'll notice it just deleted it from the mask because it got brighter and doesn't have red in it. So if we want to take this a little bit further, and just for the sake of showing it, you can see I drug down through there, and you can actually see over here in this mask where there's a sharp black point sticking up into the white. Now I don't actually want it to go that far down, so we're going to leave it here. And again, I'm going to go over here, I'm going to reduce the exposure, and then I'm going to also reduce the sharpness and increase the noise reduction. So that's it for that photo. Let's jump to the next one. So this is going to be another photo where I've done a gradient mask, and you'll see here just by looking at it that I've had it come kind of from this corner and move it up towards this city over here in this photo. Now, one thing that you can do here when talking about how you want to make sure the lighting still looks right. So you can see that this area of the photo with the face of these two cliffs were covered by the shadow of a cloud. So that tells me I can get away with doing that in the foreground of my photo here, where I've added an exposure in of -1.11. And that helps me draw the viewer's eye further out here into the photo, but also doesn't make this look too unrealistic because your eye's already telling you that there's clouds in the sky that you can see up here, and it's definitely possible that there could be a shadow over this portion of the mountain. So that's just something that you've got to get used to seeing in the photos and understanding when you use that gradient mask. Moving on to the last photo here, this is one of a cow that I took a few years ago in a snowstorm. And what I did here was, again, I wanted to draw the viewer's eye from this bottom right corner towards this face of the cow, which you'll see going into the roll of thirds is sitting roughly on the intersection point here. So I want to draw the viewer's eye towards this intersection point. Now the way I did that was taking this linear gradient mask, dragging it across the image here, and we're going to go ahead and show the overlay, just to subtly darken that. You can see on this, I didn't go too dark. I went to -0.19, but we could probably go even further here. I think that starts to look too fake though, right? If we're talking about the luminosity areas of an image, you'll notice this looks drastically brighter than this area. And that's one of those areas where it just wouldn't look right if you went that far with it. So let's drop this back down. Somewhere around -0.2 to me is what looks natural. So we're just going to leave it there, and that's probably why I went to that when I originally created this photo. If you want to see how I use this technique when editing nightscapes, you'll want to check out this video on my full editing process for photos of the Milky Way.